Ja, herzlich willkommen zurück.
Welcome back. I have the feeling that the room gets more and more crowded, and of course I'm happy about that. Quite delighted to see that. Now we're going to start off with a very interesting afternoon. During the preparation, I came across a forecast that was made during the last century, but I think it's very intriguing with regards to the next topic on our agenda. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who by many is classified as being the economist of the 21st century, wrote an essay in 1930 in which he predicted that in 100 years, which means in 2030, the working hour per week would amount to 15 hours per person only. Technical progress, growing wealth, increasing productivity, all this would make it possible for people to work less. People would no longer have to suffer from economic problems, but the main problem would be what to do with all the leisure time. Now, 2030 is still a couple of years down the road, but I think we can all agree that he might not have been correct with his projection. Keynes and his colleagues back then wondered about the consequences of industrialization. They set up different forecasts about the future of work. And I think the similarity to this discussion we are having here today is quite interesting. After World War II, in the Federal Republic of Germany, people benefited largely from the social market economy. Now many are wondering, is it still a social market economy, or are we living in a world of digital capitalism? This is why in the next 30 minutes or so we are going to zoom in on the question what the repercussions of digital capitalization are on the social welfare systems, where do adjustments have to be made, and which particular questions will conjure up that we've got to be prepared for. I'm looking forward to Anke Hassel, the director of the Institute of Economic and Social Research of the Hans Böckler Foundation. And hello to Hans-Peter Klös from the German Institute for Economic Research in Cologne. Mrs. Hassel, what do you think of when you think of people working 15 hours a week? Well, when did the reduction of working hours stop? When I think of the first 50 years after the discussion that was cropped up by John Maynard Keynes up until the mid-80s, we were on that particular path. When we look at the development of working hours, it goes to show that up until the strike of the 36-hour week, up until the mid-80s, the working hours were declined and reduced significantly. So this was a secular development. And then things were turned upside down. Working hours were no longer reduced, but in many sectors, people do no longer work 35 hours a week, but 40 hours plus. And what is that attributable is the main question. Have we not managed after the 80s to increase productivity even further? Has the economic model not led to ever more increasing wealth? Or has the regulation of the economic model been revised? We'll come to an analysis in a second. But how many hours are we going to work in 30 years from now? I think we will work less. I think we will move back onto a path of reduced working hours. I can also provide the analysis to you if you wish, because I think this has a lot to do with new family structures, with demographic developments. And I think working hours will be reduced even further. Hans-Peter Klös, what's your take on that? In the past, we've learned that the workers take home what they can do. Well, I really appreciate John Maynard Keynes as an economist, but I think in this particular point he was not really on the right path, but he was not the only one. Many people have proclaimed that work will be brought to an ending. Hannah Arendt and many others wrote about it. Working in the interdisciplinary field, they said that work is going to be ended rather soon. De facto, we are observing quite the opposite. We are talking about a lack of workers, not only in Germany, but also throughout the whole of Europe. There is a crisis in the labor market people in gainful employment on the rise. So also with regards to digital capitalism, it would be very interesting to talk about people in gainful employment and the labor market. It is not a topic of the past, but it is going to become more important in the future. I think we will work more in the future, but not so much on a weekly basis, but rather over our entire life. And this is where demographic factors have to be taken into account. Our democracy is characterized by the fact that the baby boomers will soon cease to disappear. With regards to our social welfare systems, we would be very well advised to ensure that we work longer and stay healthier over our entire lifespan. But isn't it true to say that the companies recruit workers, employees as full-time employees, and they ask them to work longer and longer hours? This is what the discussions in recent years have shown. Part-time is a very important topic, which is quite appealing, because people can work from home and send out a couple of emails in the afternoon or in the evening. Why are the employers so inflexible? It will not take you by surprise, but with regards to the working hours, we have really flexibilized a lot, which has led to fundamental changes. And Mrs. Hassel said that in recent years we tried to reduce working hours, but now we try to make working time more flexible. You can read that in each and every report about working hours. I think the work-life balance is also a very important topic, because working time over the entire lifespan is something where there is a lot of room for improvement. Making working hours more flexible over one's entire lifespan is a very important topic, because, this will be much more easy to bear for the employers and the employees. Do you think that the workers have the flexibility that they would need in the 21st century? No, I don't think so. I think we're only at the very beginning of a discussion about more flexibility, because flexibility is a question that boils down to for whom? Who is flexible? For whom are you flexible? And the employers always ask their employees to be as flexible as they can. But individual rights that need to be granted into the employees are not really granted, so that employees become more and more flexible. With regards to limited part-time work, employers really have great difficulties granting this flexibility. Irrespective of digitization, we really need a lot more flexibility due to the demographic factors. I'm fully on Mr. Klös's page. In our social welfare, we have to take account of demographic developments, not so much digitization. But against the backdrop of the demographic developments, we need to be more flexible in the interest of the individuals, which means that the employees' need to be granted their rights. They've got to be put into a position where they can organize their working hours in a flexible manner without being put at a disadvantage. The question is, why don't men work on a part-time basis? They don't do so because they don't want to, but they don't do so because they think they will be put at a disadvantage, and this is why employers need to be convinced of this. Why do men do not work on a part-time basis? Well, this is one of the classics in the course of the debate. I think we should really pay tribute to what has been achieved in recent years. I'm no longer in the 1-0 model. One person goes to work and the other spouse stays at home and raises the children. No, but normally in each and every family, 1.5 people work part-time on a full-time basis. In Germany, we have the greatest increase of women in gainful employment, also amongst elder women. We are very close to the Scandinavian level concerning women in gainful employment. We are spearheading the development in the field of part-time work. Many women work on a part-time basis, that is true to say, but here also periods of life need to be taken into account. If you start off working at a late stage, this of course has a major repercussion on your remuneration and pension entitlements. We have very good childcare institutions in this country. We still have a lot of catching up to do, but the situation is moving into the right direction. If both spouses go and work, they have very good opportunities of having their children being taken care of, also due to the differentiated forms of jobs and professions. So at the bottom line, I'm not really pessimistic with a view to digital transformation, because as an aside, it goes hand in hand with a demographic transition, I dare say. I would like to advocate the following cause. The digital transformation can provide us with ample opportunities in order to get control of the demographic transition, which might lead to a decline in wealth. But this is how we can hedge for that in order to come up with a completely new and better trajectory. Germany is the country where working hours between men and women differ most significantly at the European level, and also by way of comparison with the other OECD countries. This is a major issue because women do not have the choice between double income or single income, but in Germany we have the 1.5 income models, which are most widely spread. Most women work on a part-time basis or with a limited number of working hours. And this is a major difference compared to the other Western European OECD countries, where women are in gainful employment, not in few working hour part-time jobs, but in many hours part-time jobs. And we've had lots of discussions about it. It has a lot to do with splitting the tax brackets for spouses, but this discrepancy has never been dealt with. I'm quite positive, but in contrast to Mr. Klös, I would like to say that we have not yet progressed a lot, but we have taken one step, but there still is a long way to go. Yes, digitization is not really the buzzword in this context, and please bear with us, but the processes and changes taking place in the world of work are very much triggered by digitization. Mr. Klös, you did not mention in the course of your positive stock taking that 1.5 incomes per family has become nothing of the extraordinary. Is it really true to say that many families can no longer afford to live on one income any longer in the 21st century? So this is why we should look at the working hours. If there are 2 adults in a family, feeding the entire family, do they have to work 60 hours per week in total in order to earn the money that they need? Where does this discrepancy come from? Depending on the total volume after German unification, this was one of the effects, the total volume of work in the middle of the 2000s came down to 0. So the work volume has increased, but this differs to part-time. Part-time work accounts for 15% of the total working volume in general. And this is where the patterns have changed slightly. I would like to reply that this changed pattern of people in gainful employment within the families have led to a situation that the entire level of wealth has increased significantly. And there are more possibilities to use the family income as a consumer. And with these developments, we went into the direction that I just described. People spend a lot of money on consumption. The deposits are on the rise. And this is a development that we have observed for a long period of time. And, you know, we have reached a high level of employment and a high level of consumption. And I think we've lived in a situation of wealth for more than 10 years. I can't remember a period of time where the economy was that much on the rise that it was over the last 10 years. Remuneration, wages and salaries are on decline. Why are you laughing about this? Wages and salaries have moved sideways, so to speak. The wage ratio, the experts' report was made available today. There is a chapter on that on it. The wage ratio also includes the income generated by freelancers, and this is moving sideways, at least the impression that I have. I think wages and salaries have declined over the last 10 years of economic growth and uprising. The real wages and salaries have stagnated. I think the developments that we have observed, which of course play a very significant role when we talk about demographic effects and people in gainful employment, makes us note that with a view to the standard people in gainful employment, all the incomes have not increased over recent years. It has a lot to do with the developments in the Eurozone. It is due to the way in which Germany has embedded itself in the Eurozone with our economic model, which is very much export-oriented. But families today experience that their standard of living has not increased in recent years. And this is what you just described. In contrast to the single earner in the family, this does no longer suffice. You know, there are 1.5 incomes per family, but this doesn't give them a lot of financial leeway either. And this is why people are afraid and concerned with a view to the social welfare state. We wouldn't talk about the social welfare state 4.0 and radical new approaches if this would not be necessary, because many people in the population have the feeling that something is wrong with the labor market, despite the fact that there is full employment and economic growth. But something's also wrong with our social welfare systems, which are meant to mitigate us against social decline. And there is a discrepancy. There seems to be a superficially observed economic increase, but people have a totally different perception. They're concerned about the future. You just said that the social benefits or the social standards that our regular families are used to have increased. What does that boil down to? If you look at the daily consumption pattern that we consider to be normal in inverted commas, the levels of procurement on a general basis, we can rather calculate how many general goods of consumption people normally purchase for an ordinary TV. You've got to work 1 hour and 12 minutes. In the past, you had to work 8 hours in order to be able to afford it. I think this ratio has changed. Mr. Hassel, we want to have a controversial but also enlightened discussion. What really concerns me and keeps me busy, where the discord, of course, should be narrowed down, is that also when we look at the demoscopic developments, Allensbach report was published a couple of weeks ago, not only based on this finding, but in many other studies, we observed that there is a great deal of discrepancy in the opinion polls about people's assessment about their very personal situation. Now, the approval rates are extremely high. If people ask you, well, how do you feel? What's your take on the future? They feel quite positive, but at the same time, they are greatly concerned that things might crumble. And this feeling of uncertainty of psychologists and sociologists is something also in the media that we've got to try to dissolve in order to understand where this discrepancy comes from between the actual and the perception. We're all very much influenced and driven by perceptions, the way in which we see our environment and our home. And this needs to be put into the right context. Why is there this great discrepancy between the actual and the perception, and how can we find the appropriate political frame? Because the justified concerns of what might happen in the future, what people perceive, need to be brought under control. Part of the question is, how much is attributable to digitization? If you look at the socio-economic pendulum and look at the middle class, what are the driving forces for anxiety and concern, then digitization is not at the very top of the list. When you look at the socio-economic pendulum, here the question is attributable to a fear of loss, which has nothing to do with conventional digitization. Are people afraid of losing their job? Unemployment, the risk of unemployment is at an all-time low. This has been clarified. People are not really anxious about losing their job, afraid of losing their job. But this has not really been considered in the socioeconomic pendulum. I think if we looked at this pendulum, we would come up with a finding that this leads to the fear that people cannot really move into the right direction that they're spearheading for with their particular lives. Hans-Peter Klös referred to the economic situation, which is quite positive. And if we take into account that digitization and digital corporations influence our life and our world of work and have done so for more than 20 years, these concerns which are around, are they exaggerated? Are people overdoing it?
I think they're pretty real, but they are concentrated in a specific group in society that makes it so difficult to deal with it, because not everyone suffers from these fears. The surveys are correct. A lot of people are satisfied with their lives, and you can see that everything that we could call the upper middle class is quite okay. Everyone belonging to that class is okay with their jobs and their general situation. Now, when we look at digitalization and ask the Works Council representatives of what they hear, then the question is rather the question of intensification of labor. In households where qualification is higher, digitalization and change of work content and mobile work are more important. But they're not the same fears that are the fears of the welfare state. The fears of the welfare state, they affect the lower middle classes. And that has to do with what digitalization does to their jobs. Plus, the fact that since Agenda 2010 and the Hartz reforms, there have been insecurities in the labor market that were also perceived as such. And people ask themselves, what happens if I lose my job and don't find immediately a replacement for that? So digitalization plays a role where we, in the German economic model, bank on intermediate qualification. By comparison, in Europe, we're the country where half of the cohort of a graduation year is in a training situation. In other countries, more people go to university. So we have a pool of people with intermediate qualification who work in professions where they need this qualification. Now digitalization comes, and the question is, how does my job develop? For example, for nurses, there is more digitalization in hospitals. The question is that upgrading the job of a nurse? Does that add to a nurse's qualification? And does that make nurses mobile, upward mobile? Or is the job getting less and less important? Lots of parts of the job will be carried out by semi-skilled people, and fewer and fewer jobs are needed with qualified staff. So the question is, do I have to re-qualify? For example, do I have to upgrade my job, or do I have to live with the fact that my job is downgraded? And this is a fear among the lower middle class in Germany. I'd agree with you, but for other reasons. The intermediate qualification we have in Germany in the dual training system is still a huge asset in my mind. And I believe that the dual qualification and the academic or tertiary qualification complement each other. Part of the fact that our economy is doing so well and that we are exporting so much is due to the fact that we have a qualification mix that fits this business model. I would like to advertise for recognizing the strengths of the dual system and its ability to modernize itself. I think it is of utmost importance to have a dual and tertiary training in parallel. I agree with you, but I would like to word it differently. I personally have a concern that the slogan, the winner takes it all, is correct. The income distribution so far has been driven by qualification. Now qualification increasingly becomes a predictor how across your lifespan your income will develop, what your peer groups are, what the sociological groups of nationals and internationals are you communicate with. So I think qualification is the lever, the silver bullet in order to shape and design the digital revolution? And this is a question that starts in early childhood, in early education, and spans across a person's entire life until middle age or senior age. And we would be well advised to recognize that qualification has to be matched with digitalization. And we should have an agenda, not a master plan, but an agenda, a new agenda, in order to pursue these strategies. This is still a shortcoming in the coalition treaty, and I read the 6-page article of the SPD where qualification and digitalization are not mentioned either. But concentration of work. Let's come back to that. This is one of the reasons why people feel squeezed out. These are phenomena where in times of digitalization, complex processes are faster. Before digitalization, people sent a letter by mail. A couple of days later, they received an answer. They could sleep over it. But these communication processes have considerably accelerated. Our workers achieve much more than before, but in addition to increasing stress levels, the digitalization dividend people always talk about doesn't seem to benefit workers or employees. Well, the digitalization dividend can be seen in increased employment. The question is whether we see it in increasing income. When I say the winner takes it all, my personal concern is that there is an asynchronous development in the different qualification levels. We have the Silicon Valley model on the one hand, this kind of capitalism, and on the other hand, we have Industry 4.0 capitalism or market economy capitalism as we have it in Germany. Now the question is, what qualification do we need? Now coming back to the stress level issue, of course we have a concentration and densification of work. It wouldn't have worked otherwise. But the question is whether this is or eustress or distress, positive or negative stress. The question is, can digitalization help us employees, most of you probably are employees, to become stronger and more resilient in doing our jobs? Let's not forget one thing. Digitalization includes a huge opportunity. It can do away with jobs that are monotonous and repetitive, and most people would consider that positive. I think digitalization is the further development of technical progress and helps us to no longer have to perform jobs we do not like to perform, so we have capacity for other types of employment. Will there be enough work for everyone? Yes. I agree with a lot of what you said, also in the context of education. But let's simply check off certain issues where we don't have any difference here. Regarding education, we agree. We don't need additional analysis. We just need more implementation. Education is the important factor in this discussion. And when you ask the question whether digitalization can do away with hazardous work or cumbersome work, I'd say yes too. But how can we regulate work so individuals can be protected against the assault of the digital world? So regulating jobs so individuals can say, okay, I won't read my mails after 6 or 8 p.m. or whenever. And then we would have a dispute how to regulate it, who should regulate it. But your question whether we have enough work, yes, I agree completely with the previous speaker, no doubt about it. I think nobody here would say that digitalization or would doubt that digitalization helps us work in the future. Certain jobs will no longer exist because of digitalization, but other jobs will be created by digitalization. In the field of social services, these jobs are created and we absolutely need them. If we look at care professions, there is a great need for investment there. I don't think we will have less work. We will have just as much work as we have now. So there are wild speculations and very different assumptions here, right? There are projections assuming that globally millions of jobs will disappear. We do not have to go into the details here, but you can respond to that, of course. Well, I think the point when it comes to the question how digitalization affects work is polarization. Polarization between qualifications and income profiles. We see that in almost all the OECD countries. There's an increase in the lower range and intermediate qualification jobs are disappearing. That's an important finding. It has to do with the middle class. It has to do with democratic abilities. So that is one criterion. The other criterion is acceleration. If we look at the forecast, how many jobs will be destroyed, I'd say they disappear, but others will be created. And the speed of change has changed, and we have to find responses for that. In the context of demography, because we are an aging society, and in an aging society, we are not able and willing to change so fast. So if you look at further education and the discussion there and what's happening or not happening there, we need much more further training to become fit for the labor market, but this further training doesn't take place. And this is due to the individual employees not wanting to train further. And they say, leave me alone. I no longer want to train in another activity. So we shouldn't blame it all on the employees, but we should ask the question, what conditions are necessary? So after 20 years of working in a specific job, people can be motivated because their job characteristics might change, that they want to prepare for other developments. It's a mental issue, but it's also an education issue and a question of how to support that financially. Well, this would be the theme of an entire conference, education and digitalization. Mr. Klös, before you react to that, I would like to bring our discussion in a different direction. I understood that companies are always unnerved when the state prescribes everything. They claim that the collective bargaining partners can do it much better. Is it still a time where employees can be represented by works councils, or is it a time where employees can no longer be represented by these bodies because they no longer have a permanent employment? Well, before I answer that question, let me express that I feel very humble. As a non-IT specialist, I don't know whether this wave of digitalization, this transformation wave, artificial intelligence, etc., can be compared to earlier forms of technological change. Researchers disagree here. There are several studies, you quoted some of them. And I believe there is a certain reality check taking place where people find that so far we have had no negative employment effects. But that is based on extrapolation of the status quo. I don't know whether artificial intelligence is such a quantum leap and how that impacts our projections for work 2030. We should still remain open and have a close look of what's happening and exchange experience with other disciplines to find proof of evidence. But now coming to your questions. Actually, there were two questions. You called them solo and click workers and a question of regulation that is necessary for these jobs. Also the question, do the legislators have to come in or do the social partners solve the problem? We had a strategy agreement bringing our collective bargaining system to a status it has today, that is outside of government circles. I think this is a success model and still is one and remains one. But I think this partnership has decreased in importance because some employees are not directly covered by works councils and trade unions. And what is created by these developments? They are no longer bound by collective bargaining agreements, but then there could also be a change due to digitalization. And we have to look at what the specific situation of these click workers is. There has been a study recently published by the Ministry of Labor with Seaway, where the largest database has been evaluated looking at the prevalence of click working. Up to 6.8% of employees are so-called click workers. But for the first time, we have an empirical picture of these click workers, and the majority of them, and you can correct me, are not self-employed people, but they have auxiliary jobs. This is what the study reported. And I think it makes a lot of sense to look at the details. What is the structure in this cloud working, click working, platform work? And if the result is that there are security gaps that might come up or might increase, then I see reasons for intervention, but not before that. When is regulation necessary? Proactively, or something's coming up? Or is regulation necessary when something develops, and then we should observe the process closely and intervene when it's necessary? That is also maybe a controversial issue here. No, it's not a controversial issue at this juncture, because we also have our own study regarding click workers and arrive at the same conclusions. So click workers generally work in a second job as click workers. It's not their main occupation. And they're usually very satisfied with that additional job. And they don't complain a lot. So for me, the click workers wouldn't be the area we have to focus on and we have to get active in. And we wouldn't consider it a social issue how to deal with click workers in the future. But what we also see, and this brings us back to the old social issues, not to the new social issues because of digitalization, but the question is that click workers are people who in their main profession are working in an area where the income is not enough to really provide for all their expenses. So they need an additional job. The click worker can work at home or can work for Amazon as a freelancer. But the main question is, why can't they live off their regular employment? Why don't they have the income they want and the income they need? And this brings us back to another old topic. By European comparison, Germany has the largest low-income sector that hasn't decreased. And we have to consider how the people who are now in employment in the low-wage sector can be supported. This has not much to do with digitalization. It has much more to do with the old classical capitalism and not with new capitalism. But of course, digitalization influences our working life. And yes, Mr. Klös, I would have said that people in their spare time have to invest time for click working in order to improve their income. We can dispute whether that is a positive or a negative situation. And I would like to bring in the next question, although we don't have much time. I understood what both of you said in a way that we're not entering a situation where there is a massive lack of work, because that would then lead to the question, how can we develop a social security system for gainful employment in the 21st century? But we can say in Germany now a lot of people have jobs. Now, it is only natural that wages are the important lever here.
Resultante der
The developments of wages are the results of one's individual productivity at the workplace. Please forgive me. Forgive me for this déformation professionnelle of an economist who compares remuneration with productivity rates. Of course, there are other decisive factors as well. Productivity at the workplace depends on the company and the employer, and the company has a certain productivity level. How that affects profits or wages is a question that has to do with regulation and not with individual productivity. And that is actually what it all boils down to. That is actually the most disputed point also in connection with digital business models. How do you allocate value added? And with a view to the winner takes it all, there are probably other panels on the regulation of corporations. Here, the added value is not allocated to all those who contribute to it. So whenever collective agreements are in a place in order to regulate the situation, that's fine. That covers 50% of the people in gainful employment, 50%. And here, of course, the social partners, based on certain criteria, try to come up with the appropriate ratios. You know, this is nothing that has to do with the state, and we don't want to play it down or neglect it. But the main question is, and this brings me back to an argument that brings us back to the question, how about the remuneration in the social service sector? Here in the field of digitization, you might also use the term of automation or robotarization. Wherever technical progress is integrated into the workplace, productivity can increase. And it helps you increase remuneration. This is why digitization gives us a chance to increase wages and salaries in the services sector, which we need so urgently, in order to say this openly and candidly. So I think this is an excellent opportunity. And wages and salaries over one's entire life will be very much oriented on one's productivity level. That's what I'm very much convinced of. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to throw the floor open to you in the audience. There's a first request for the floor over here. Young gentleman in the back of the room.
Es kommt ein Mikro. Ich kann jetzt im Moment noch nicht sagen, aus welcher Himmelsrichtung, aber
Please be so kind and wait for the mic. I'm sure that there is a mic on its way.
Mein Name ist Christian.
Christian Wessel is my name. I think the discussion is a bit too blue-eyed. Digitization only brings about improvements and helps increase productivity? Not too sure. I think we need to look at scenarios where disruption has occurred. Autonomous driving. If this will be established in the next 10 or 15 years to such a way that activities in the low-wage sector will be completely made redundant, brushing or waste disposal vehicles drive automatically in warehouses. No single person will be working any longer because processes will be fully automized and entire jobs will be made redundant. Let's think about office jobs. Of course, AI and its recent successes also have their downsides. For example, in medical technology, in this year's progress has not been as high as IBM, for example, or other companies anticipated. But if we look 10 or 15 years down the road, then it might be the case that entire jobs will completely disappear. Controllers will no longer be needed because the controllers, which use a lot of human intelligence in order to review the invoices, will no longer be needed. What impact is that going to have on society if entire jobs will cease to disappear? May I ask you to ask a question, or may I distill it down? Mrs. Hassel, you also told us, what I remember very well, is that there will always be enough work for each and everyone. How can you be so confident? Well, I'm confident and positive for historical reasons. This is what we've learned from history. We are not facing technological innovations for the first time. The same holds true for disruption. There were also disruptive processes in place in the past. And I would like to agree to what Mr. Klös has said. We don't know what to anticipate. There are certain scenarios and an analysis, but we don't know how they will materialize. And maybe I'm not correct, but maybe in 15 years there will be mass unemployment induced by technological developments. Maybe low-skilled jobs will no longer be on demand, and people with low qualifications will no longer be able to find a job. Against the backdrop of what I have learned from experience so far, and according to how I read the literature, I would not think that this is rather likely going to happen. It is possible, but not very likely, because there are also other sectors, and they will continue to exist, for example, in the field of social services, where there are wide gaps. In the field of education, care, healthcare, providing care to people in need, providing care to the elderly. There we really have a lot of jobs for people with low skills. The only question is, how do they have to be organized? How will they be paid? How can you fund these social services which are greatly in demand? And I think if it is foreseeable that we will have to do something in this regard, and if there are greater demands in other sectors, then we can get them politically organized. That is why I'm so confident, because I don't think that we have any other option. I don't know how we should prepare ourselves for the fact that in many areas of society, a lot of low-skilled jobs will cease to exist, and in a preemptive manner, we say that we build up a sector for people with low skills. I think from a political and economic viewpoint, this wouldn't make any sense. On to the next question, because there are a lot of requests from the floor in the audience. Gentleman in the back. One more request for the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Klös. I think the reduction of working hours over one's entire life, over the week, needs to support the transformation triggered by digitization, simply because I think that the workload will be shifted, but the entire workload will not necessarily continue to increase. So the entire workload of the individual over one's entire lifespan needs to be reduced. You spoke about the differentiation between the actual and the personal perception, the increase of precarious jobs, the high level of people with a low income. These are not really perception, but actual uncertainties about one's pension. This is not a perception, but an actual fear. People can no longer afford to pay their rents. This is not a question that boils down to perception, but is a real and true and genuine question. In the lower class of society, but also in the lower parts of the middle class, there are enough actual facts around which are a reason for uncertainty. And I think, therefore, it's not that easy to differentiate between people's perception and their actual reality. Second point, Mr. Klös and Mrs. Hassel, you also spoke about qualification in order to come to terms with digital transformation. That's a priority. Fair enough. That's the way it should be. Apart from a further reduction of working hours, this is the very second important step to take. But why is it so that up until today, further training, vocational training, is an additional service that has to be provided for the employer, and is nothing that can be taken for granted in each and every single period of one's working life, at each and every step? Why is it not fully integrated? That would be a true revolution. You know, qualification is one of our utmost priorities, that's fair enough. But it does not only help the employer to gain more ground, but it's also very important for the very survival of the corporations. And this is why it should be fully integrated into people's daily work and daily working life. And it should not be left to the devices of the employer, and then it's up to the employee to make a major effort in order to receive further training. Mr. Klös, you might come in on that if you may in a second. But even if I make myself rather unpopular right now, I would like to kindly ask you in the audience to ask questions in order to fuel the debate. I think this will help us to fuel the debate if you ask questions. Mr. Klös, what's your reply? On to part number one, working hours, I disagree. Secondly, perception versus actual. Always look at the average observation or individuals. Question housing, yes. No. Social question, yes. That's the way it is. Precarious employment? No. People working in regular employment conditions are on the rise and have been since 2008. This is nothing that will phase out, but this is the prevailing kind of employment. Precarious jobs, well, there's sometimes even a decline. Low-wage sector, yes, fair enough, it's high, but not on the rise any longer. This has a lot to do with the composition of the population. But let me draw our attention to the following fact. Let's not forget that Germany is a country undergoing profound transformation with a view to the composition of the population. Let's not forget it. When we talk about poverty, the composition of our population differs to the population 20 years ago, and more people with a migrant background are prone to falling into poverty with a lack of qualifications. In order to come up with a reasonable investment policy and social policy, the question is, which measures do we offer with which particular target group instead of looking at the average? Qualification, as far as I know, every 3 years we invest 32 million, 80% of them during the working hours of the employees. The remaining 20% can be shifted back between the employees and the companies. But here digitization provides us with ample opportunities. Learning on the job by using digital tutorials might help very well in order to increase further training levels in general. The lady in the front.
Hello, my name is Sophia Lee. I'm an associate professor from a university in South Korea. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the welfare state, especially continental European welfare state. Maybe we can characterize it with the strong characteristics of social insurance. With the income or the entrance of the digital age, I think the three fundamental changes that can have an effect on the welfare state is whether the employment relationship, the employer and the employee relationship is going to be more murky. Second is how you're going to calculate the income level and the working hours and where you are working, because most of the social insurance or social security system is based on earnings related. So how that change in the labor market, especially with digitalization, will have an impact on the German welfare state. And third is the change in the unionization rate. So particularly the bargaining power has had a significant impact on the welfare state. So I would like to hear more about the implication on the welfare state specifically. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank für diese sehr umfassende Frage, die jetzt im Wesentlichen darauf abzielt.
Thank you very much for this rather comprehensive question, predominantly dealing with the repercussions that emerge from a lower level of unionization. There were two more points that were mentioned. Employment with social insurance contributions and the calculation of incomes. This is a really complicated and far-reaching question, I have to say. If you look at the conservative model for the social welfare state, I think it is true to say at the current moment in time that the most important question is to which extent is the German welfare state going to become more universal? Similar to the liberal or Scandinavian countries, certain services or benefits of the social welfare sector need to be made available to all the different groups in the population, irrespective of their employment situation. You know, if you look at the situation in other countries, you will realize that there are many more universal benefits. For example, with regards to the pension, a basic pension is available for each and everyone, irrespective of the employment situation that a person is in. This is one direction. The other direction might be, and this has something to do with the reasons that you mentioned, level of unionization, changes in the labor market. The other question is, how strong is the social security system as a component in order to shape our world of work and the social welfare state in the future? For a long time, we've thought that, well, social security, on the one hand, is not very known for the reallocation level that we would like to achieve. Sometimes it's a bit bulky, and people who are very well integrated in the labor market are much more secure compared to those who are marginalized or who are in precarious jobs. Well, I might have thought that, well, maybe this is no longer the most appropriate tool in order to guarantee a social welfare state in the future. I think we need social security. It will never be abolished or weakened. In the future, too, our social security system will be of utmost significance because it makes it possible for us, due to social benefits, to make adjustments with regard to particular target groups. And this can only be achieved if you introduce a pension scheme which can calculate people's lifetime working hours, and entitlements are adjustments necessary for certain people in certain positions. Can certain periods within which people were unemployed be covered with the help of other benefits? I'm very much in favor of social security, and I think it's also fit for the future. Mr. Klös, I think you said yes, didn't you? Maybe you would like to react rather quickly before we listen to the last questions. I think our social security system is performing very well. We just have to make it more resilient in the future. I'm open-minded towards insurance contributions mandatory for self-employed people with a view to the bailout strategies if old age poverty arises due to a lack of old age provisions. This is nothing that should be accepted. It has a lot to do with the symmetries within the system. You know, we're open-minded. And all that should matter is the facts. The second point is who pays into the social security system. Here we need to take a closer look. Normally we're saying that the people who have to contribute to social security increase. So I think we are not going to turn away from the social welfare idea that was developed by Bismarck, but we just have to make it fit for the future. One more request for the floor. In the audience, the gentleman with the red scarf. And then we have to come to a close, unfortunately, but we still have time. Markus Ahlefeld. Why do we have the feeling that technological transformation is hitting us so hard? I think because it affects our world of work and our private life with the same type of media. And how can we regulate this appropriately without becoming too pervasive and infringing upon people's freedoms or people's right of self-determination? Thank you very much. Okay, but please be brief. I would like to allude to that. I think this is one of the most important points. Digitization affects us as human beings in all walks of life, no matter what we do. Digitization doesn't stop at the world of work. It affects our living, the way when we drive around, we're affected each and everywhere, and we in the population really have to come to terms with that. What does digitization mean to us? Which additional opportunities does it offer to us? And what are the self-imposed limitations? This is something that has a lot to do with our understanding of what human beings are all about. Clemens Witte is my name. I just wanted to know the following. I know that you are all against basic general income, but what are the main arguments? Oh, really, keep it as short and sweet as possible. Because it touches the very root of employment and it discourages people from trying to find a job and being in gainful employment. And this is totally unacceptable to me. That at least is my perception of human beings. It is the opposite of integration. Integration takes place at the workplace, at school, in society by and large, wherever you're active. And the labor market is the biggest integrational driving force. And officially, we are a country of immigration with an immigration rate of 1 million net per year. I cannot really imagine that this is possible to achieve in any other fashion, and the universal basic income would really run counter to that. Thank you very much to you, both of you. Thanks very much to you in the audience for all your attention, for all your questions. I don't know why time is flying, but Now the next round of fora will be held. Please look at your map in the program in order to find out whether we'll meet. But we will meet again in the plenary hall at 4 o'clock, and then we will talk about the smart